Well, I've just decided that I like my weird yellow-green chrysanthemum and it's gonna live that way and that's totally fine. So this is going to become my chrysanthemum jitter. This is going to become, just to keep the number of letters in my tabs down, it's going to become my mum tab. And I'm going to move on because my next flower is a tulip. So I'm going to make a new tab for the tulip. I'm going to pause this render, turn off the chrysanthemum, and the tulip is where we get into our first big problem. Because I don't know if you knew this about tulips, but their petals have more than one color on them. And that color isn't always evenly distributed across the petal. It's usually like something at the tip and then a really defined thing. And in order to do this properly, like look at that little edge color there. Look at how these have like variegations on them. These have stripes on them. Look at that. That's pretty intense. So this is really the first one where we just really need to know what the actual petal thinks that its UV shape is so that we can paint a very specific texture. So up to now, all of the texture mapping that we've done has been with whatever the default UV map is. But once we start with more complex flowers, like the tulip and the iris that I've got here, we're going to start needing more information. And I know that not everybody has tulips or irises in their scene. What I'm going to say is that for your own vase of flowers, I need to see you do this process at least once. Ideally, you would do it for every single flower. But you probably don't have that kind of time, so for at least one flower, I'm going to ask you to just take a look at what your petals look like in the UV editor. So technically this is the third window that we need for this assignment, and that is totally fine. The other two are really big ones. The UV editor is useful. Every time you make a model, you should be looking at its UVs. We'll see how that goes. So you can find the UV editor in a couple of ways. First, since you're in your modeling tools, it'll be in the UV menu under UV editor. And second, if you go to Windows, Modeling Editors, it's right here, UV editor. I'm going to go ahead and open that up. The first thing you need to know about the UV editor is that it will only show you your selected object. So if you've been working on something for a few hours, and then suddenly you click off of it and you're like, oh no, where did my UVs go? You just clicked off, it's fine. You can click back on. So the default petal UV map looks like an upside down letter T. And the reason for that is that we made these things out of cubes. And you'll remember that I said that the cube is the most petal-like object. Well, it is. It's just that the UVs don't know that. So the UVs probably make more sense if I pull up just a regular cube here. And now you can see that the upside down T is just an unfolded box. So if I go into face mode, this face corresponds with this part of the T. Then there's this one. That looks like the neck of the T. That's the tip of the T. So each part of the T is just a face of the box. And what we're seeing when we look at the tulip petal is just all the different faces. But it's the same thing. It's just that's what the default UV map of a cube looks like. And it's fine. That's fine. The terminology at work is that this thing right here is referred to as a UV shell. And a UV shell is a group of UVs within a single border. And in this case, the T runs all the way around. So this is a single UV shell that represents an entire object. If you want to see that a little more clearly, you can use these icons across the top. This one here will show you shell shading. So I can see that this is this nice blue color, and that can be useful because sometimes when you are adjusting UVs, you will do fun things like overlap them or reverse them, in which case the shell shading will turn this red color for reversed and various colors for overlap. In this case, kind of a magenta because it's blue plus red, or just a darker blue if they're just overlapping. So knowing that the shell looks like a T because the petal is a box, just like this box, is kind of helpful because it just lets you understand what you're starting with. I don't want this UV mapping to get too complicated. I really don't. This is your first ever UV map, so right now just remember your petal looks like a letter T because it's a cube. The UV editor gives you a whole bunch of tools for dealing with UVs, and the first one I'm going to show you is over here in the UV toolkit. There's a section called Unfold. I'm going to twirl that down and I'm just going to run the command unfold. And now when I look at this UV map, it should look much more similar to my actual flower petal. So if I go into face mode, this face corresponds to this face. This face corresponds to this face. So now, just like in shape and texture, I'm a lot closer. This stuff up here is the top of the petal where the top curves across from the outside to the inside, and that's pretty good. I'm okay with that, and just knowing that is going to be helpful for me. So in many ways, this is a perfectly fine UV map because when I look at it, I can see this is the outside of the petal, this is the inside of the petal. I am sincerely hoping, so sincerely hoping, that yours will do the same thing when they unfold. Your number one goal in UV mapping is just to get your UVs to be recognizable to the shape of the model. And that's especially true for youngsters like you because you're just learning. As we get more complex, we will talk about cutting border edges in, unfolding additional times, and fun things like that. But for the moment, because this is our first ever UV map, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take this, and although the UVs are much better than what we started with, and we've still only got one shell, there's only one little finicky thing that I have to do. So I'm going to right click in my UV editor, go into UV shell mode, and I'm just going to take this, I'm going to move it up a little. Because you see that the UV editor is a big grid. The grid has a quadrant 1, and the quadrant 1 is referred to as the 0 to 1 space because it goes from the origin point to 1 in the U direction and from 0 to 1 in the V direction. The 0 to 1 space is the only part of the entire map where textures will be applied. Any place outside of 0 to 1, textures will be tiled but not applied directly. So I need to be sure that my UV map fits inside of 0 to 1. I'm just going to scale it down a little bit. So that is my very first ever UV map, and I'm sincerely hoping that yours will be just as easy as mine. I'm going to stop here with my UV map back in the 0 to 1 space, which I did with my regular move and my regular scale tool. The only tool I used inside the UV toolkit was Unfold. I used that while I was still in object mode, but if it's giving you any trouble, go over to UV shell selection mode, have your shell selected, and then try unfolding again. We're going to pause here. In the next video, I will pick up and talk about how to export this UV map so that we can take it into the painting program of your choice.